Good morning, students. I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to class. Now, in our previous lecture in modern Indian history, we had already covered the August offer and the individual satyagraha. The next important set of developments would precipitate in the year of 1942, beginning with the Cripps Proposal. Right? Now, like the August offer, it was also an attempt made by the British in order to secure the full-fledged support of Indians for their war effort. And this time around, the circumstances for the Cripps proposal were also prepared by developments that had been taking place during the war itself. The war had taken a very menacing turn for the British, especially in the Asian theater. Japan had entered the war against the British directly in December of 1941 with the Pearl Harbor attack against the Americans. This had also pulled the Americans into the war, and the British were facing the pressure from two sides, from their allies also and from their enemies also. The Japanese, following their success at Pearl Harbor, had quickly capitalized upon their advantage and attacked the British and French colonies in Southeast Asia, namely Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Malay, Singapore, and had even encroached into Burma. In the in the eastern part of Burma, the British forces were being folded back by the Japanese advance. So there was a greater urgency among the British to secure the support of Indians, while on the other side, the British were also being pressurized by their other allies, that is the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians, in order to secure Indian support. And therefore, Sir Stafford Cripps, who was a member of Winston Churchill's war cabinet, and he was also a prominent leader of the Labour Party, which was in opposition, right? So in 1940, Winston Churchill's Conservative Party had come to power by defeating Neville Chamberlain, right? However, due to the ongoing war, as had been a convention for the British, they had opted to form a national government. That means a government formed with the support of all major political parties in order to show solidarity in the backdrop of the war. And that is why some labor members had also been given important positions in Winston Churchill's war cabinet. One of them was Sir Stafford Cripps. He was sent to India as a single member mission in March of 1942 in order to secure Indian support. He led a single member mission to seek Indian support in the war effort. Right? The failure of the August offer and the individual satyagraha had ensured that the bulk of Indians under Congress leadership disavowed India from the war. They rejected the idea that the British could unilaterally make India part of the war. So this was the same issue that had led to the resignation of the Congress ministries, and on the basis of that position, the Indians had been demanding complete independence. That if the British were ready to give India complete independence, then India would give unconditional support to the British. Now, the British were not ready to do this, and the Indians were also not ready to seek any or to negotiate any settlement regarding this issue moving forward. Right now, The Indian leadership at this time was also quite divided, right? There was one group led by leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and others who wanted India to launch a mass movement to oppose British rule. Others, such as C. Rajgopalachari, wanted to pledge support to the British if the British were ready to concede complete independence. On the other hand, Mahatma Gandhi was of the opinion that he could not morally oppose British rule if he is supporting the war effort against fascism. But at the same time, he was also willing to wait and watch what the British were ready to offer Indians. So he was morally opposed to a mass movement, but was ready to defend India's right to Poon Swaraj. Right? And in the end, Jawaharlal Nehru and Maulana Azad with the support of some other prominent leaders such as C. Rajgopalachari, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and others, were chosen as the Congress's two official negotiators. To meet Stafford Cripps and negotiate the finer points regarding the proposal and the transfer of power, right? So this was the background of the Cripps proposal. Now you can give a subheading. एक heading दो Cripps proposal, उसके अंदर subheading दो introduction, slash background, and within this, right, in March 1942, comma, Sir Stafford Cripps headed a single member mission with a set of constitutional proposals to seek Indian support for the British war effort. Next point. Cripps was a labor member, was a labor member of Winston Churchill's conservative war cabinet, was a labor member of Winston Churchill's conservative war cabinet. Full stop. Previously, comma, Cripps had expressed open sympathy for the Indian national movement, right? That is why Churchill and his cabinet thought that he was the best person to negotiate a settlement with Indians. Previously, he had expressed open sympathy for the Indian national movement, and thus was considered the most suitable British politician to rally Indian support. एक सब हेडिंग और दो. Factors behind sending the Cripps mission. Factors behind sending the Cripps mission. Write down. The Cripps mission was a symbol of Britain's growing desperation as the war had taken a menacing turn in the backdrop, or sorry, had taken a menacing turn in the Pacific theater. Full stop. Following the Pearl Harbor raid, in brackets 7th of December 1941, comma, the Japanese had quickly overrun all of Southeast Asia, forcing the British to rout. A rout is a disorderly retreat. Forcing the British to rout from Malay, Singapore, and Burma. Full stop. Therefore, Indian support had become crucial. Therefore, Indian support had become crucial. Full stop. Next point लिखो. Britain was also being pressurized was also being pressurized by its allies, by its allies, namely the USA, the USSR, and China, to secure wholehearted Indian to secure wholehearted Indian cooperation, to secure wholehearted Indian cooperation, right? So in one sense, in the eyes of the allies, it was a question of Britain's sincerity towards the war effort. It was an occasion for the British government to show to its other allies that it was sincere about defeating Germany and it was sincere about their common cause, right? So Britain was also being pressurized by its allies, namely the USA, USSR, and China, to secure wholehearted Indian support. Next sub point, next point, right? The Indian leadership, the Indian leadership had also indicated, had also indicated that it would readily support, that it would readily support Britain's war, Britain's war, if power was transferred immediately, if power was transferred immediately, and the promise of complete independence after the war, and the promise of complete independence after the war was given, and the promise of complete independence after the war was given. Full stop. Okay? So these were the factors due to which Stafford Cripps was sent to India as a single member mission. First of all, pressure because of the advances made by Japan in Southeast Asia. Second, pressure by Britain's allies. And third, the indication of a negotiated settlement given by the Indian leadership. इसी हेडिंग के अंदर further continue. Next point you can write down. The Indian leadership seemed to be divided, full stop. While the Congress had unanimously decided, to resign, following Governor General Linlithgow's decision to unilaterally declare war on Germany, on India's behalf, comma, there was little agreement with regards to the strategy to be followed, write down. Next point or sub point you can write. Some Congress leaders wanted to launch a revolt against British rule. Next subpoint. Others such as C. Rajgopalachari wanted to offer the British an olive branch by supporting the war effort in the hope that this would be reciprocated with independence after the war. Next subpoint. While Gandhiji was opposed to any mass movement as it would be morally inconsistent with his support for the war effort. While Gandhiji was opposed to any mass movement as it was morally inconsistent with his support for the war effort, comma, he also declined to openly endorse the war. Believing that the British were insincere about Indian aspirations. Next subpoint. Ultimately, comma, the Congress appointed Jawaharlal Nehru and Maulana Azad as their two official negotiators with respect to the Cripps mission. Full stop. Next subpoint. Jinnah, the prominent Muslim League leader, supported the British war effort unequivocally. That means completely supported the British war effort. And criticized the Congress policy. The policy of not supporting the British war effort, and criticized the Congress policy. Full stop. He insisted upon Pakistan and rejected the Congress's call, the Congress's call for pan-Indian for pan-Indian unity, for pan-Indian unity and immediate independence, or immediate transfer of power, for pan-Indian unity and independence and immediate independence immediate independence, right? So he wanted the British to first divide India and only then transfer power. So that is why he supported the British war effort, tried to paint the Congress as a sympathizer of the Nazis and the Japanese as a fascist party, and he tried to convince the British to partition India before leaving. Pledged complete support on behalf of Indian Muslims as well as the Muslim League to the British war effort. Right? So these were the circumstances for the sending of the Cripps proposal and the position of different segments of the Indian leadership. We have also discussed that what the outcome of the internal discourse within the cabinet was with regards to the Cripps proposal. Now, next we need to talk about the proposal itself. What were its provisions? Right? Now, it consisted of 4 provisions, namely, number 1, India would become a dominion of the British Empire after the end of the war. In other words, the Cripps proposal offered dominion status to India after the end of the war. Okay? Secondly, it was clarified that India would have the freedom to decide the nature of its relationship with the United Nations and the British Commonwealth, including the right to leave it. Right? So that means while dominion status had been offered to Indians, if the Indians were to later decide to leave the British Commonwealth of Nations, they would be effectively exiting the British Empire. So it was dominion status with a path towards complete independence. But the British believed that the Indians would not choose to do this, as membership of the Commonwealth of Nations would prove to be very advantageous to a newly independent country, since it would provide that country with a sound economic relationship with what was at that point of time one of the leading industrial powers of the entire world, with its own overseas empire, which had emerged as the biggest economic powerhouse of the last 500 years or so. Right? Thirdly, it provided that a constituent assembly would be set up after the war, consisting of only Indians, to draft a new constitution for India. Right? Now, this was an improvement over the August offer, since in the August offer it had been proposed that the Constituent Assembly would be composed primarily of Indians, but this time there was a guarantee that it would consist of only Indians with no British interference. And lastly, it promised that provisions would be made to ensure the participation of princely states in the Constituent Assembly. Right? For the first time, the British indicated that they were interested in establishing a more complete union of India by integrating the princely states with the future dominion of India. Right? So these were the four important provisions. क्या क्या है? Dominion status after the end of the war. India would have the freedom to decide the future relationship with the United Nations as well as the British Commonwealth of Nations, including the right to leave them. A constituent assembly would be established after the war, consisting of only Indians, and finally, that provisions would be made to ensure the participation of princely states in the constituent assembly. Right? Along with this, Cripps also made two clarifications. क्या क्या? That in case if no Indian plan could be finalized regarding the mechanism to constitute a constituent assembly, then it would be created by or created through indirect elections from the provincial assemblies. Right? So its members would be elected indirectly from the provincial legislative assemblies by the assemblies themselves. Secondly, princely states would be represented in the Constituent Assembly by members nominated by the rulers, right? So over here, no democratic mechanism would be used. The princely states would be represented by members handpicked by the native rulers themselves. So these were the two clarifications that it gave, right? So this was also a major step forward as compared to the August offer. Since in the August offer, there had been no solid mechanism for the creation of the Constituent Assembly, but यहाँ पे clarify कर दिया गया था, and princely states would be represented by members nominated by the rulers, right? So this was also clarified. However, Cripps also insisted upon the fulfillment of two conditions, which in a way torpedoed the proposal altogether. Firstly, he insisted that the provinces would have the right to reject the constitution and secede from the Indian Union, right? So there were 11 British Indian provinces. They would have the right to individually ratify the constitution or reject it. Through ratification, they would give their approval to join the Indian Union, and if they chose to reject it, then some other arrangement would be made. That means they would have rejected the accession to the Indian Union and they would be set up as an independent country, right? And secondly, the Constituent Assembly would have to sign a treaty with the British government covering all issues arising out of the transfer of power, right? So this was inserted in order to ensure that if any province actually rejected the constitution and decided that it wanted to be established as a separate country, then the Constituent Assembly and its successor, that is the Union of India, would not use aggression in order to annex the territory of that new independent country. The British government was willing to guarantee the independence of all such constituent parts of the Indian subcontinent, which would in the future decide to remain independent and out of Indian authority, out of Indian control, right? So these were the different provisions, clarifications and conditions of the proposal. India would become a dominion of the British Empire after the end of the war. India would have the freedom to decide the nature of its relationship with the United Nations and the Commonwealth, including the right to leave it. A constituent assembly would be set up after the war, consisting of only Indians, to draft a new constitution for India, and provisions would be made for the participation of princely states in the constituent assembly. If no Indian plan to make a constituent assembly could be finalized, then it would be created by through indirect elections from the provincial assemblies, and princely states would nominate their members to the constituent assembly. The provinces would have the right to self-determination. That means they could either accept or reject the constitution, and the Constituent Assembly would have to agree to enter into a treaty with the British government covering all the issues arising out of the transfer of power. Right? So these are the different provisions of the Cripps Proposal. Now let us look at how it was different as compared to the August offer. Right? Departure from the August offer. Write down. Number one, the Cripps proposal offered India the right to leave the British Commonwealth. Full stop. This effectively represented a path towards complete independence. Right? And this possibility had been completely rejected by the August offer. So this way it had a major departure from the August offer. Number two, while the August offer proposed a constituent assembly consisting of primarily Indians, comma, the Cripps proposal offered a constituent assembly consisting of only Indians. Full stop. For the first time, the British openly admitted, openly admitted that drafting, drafting an Indian constitution was the exclusive right was the exclusive right of Indians. Of Indians. Write down number 3. Unlike the August offer, unlike the August offer, comma, there was no overemphasis on minority opinion in the Cripps proposal. There was no overemphasis on minority opinion in the Cripps proposal. The August offer had given a minority veto to the minorities, but this time around there was no such a special provision for entertaining the minority opinion. Right? Now, this was a symptom of not only the growing desperation of the British, but also of the idea that the Congress was the sole legitimate representative of all Muslims and that the government was more than willing to negotiate with it as the representative of all Indians. Write down this legitimized the Congress's position as the sole representative as the sole representative of all Indians of all Indians. Right? Next point, number 4. Unlike the August offer, unlike the August offer, comma, the Cripps proposal, the Cripps proposal outlined a concrete plan outlined a concrete plan to create a constituent assembly to create a constituent assembly. ठीक है, क्या बोला था that if any Indian plan to constitute a constituent assembly could not be finalized, then the constituent assembly members would be indirectly elected by the provincial legislative assemblies and the princely states would be participating through nominated members. Number 5 लिखो. For the first time, the British accepted the geographical unity of India by insisting upon the participation of princely states. Right. Ever since 1857, it had been the policy of the British to maintain the princely states as independent powers. right? So this they were doing in order to prevent the emergence of a wider national unity across the entire subcontinent. Now they accepted the idea that princely states were politically part of the geographic whole, that is the Indian subcontinent, and could not continue independently, right? So this was a major departure from the previous British position. Further, right, number 6. However, as compared to the August offer, the Cripps proposal made a more direct assault on Indian unity by granting the British Indian provinces, the right to self-determination. Right? Now, if we consider this objectively, we can also find that this was in fact a long-term British design in order to suppress the growth of wider nationalism and weaken the national movement. The British had been experimenting with this idea as early as 1919, when they had granted diarchy in the provinces, and in order to further promote provincialism, they had granted the provinces complete autonomy. They believed that the different provinces would therefore choose to follow their own independent politics free from any national control. So, an all India opposition against the British rule could be avoided. Now, this was a maturation of that same policy of promoting provincialism. The British felt that since this idea of self-determination would be so unappealing, so reprehensible to the Indian nationalist leadership, that they would rather choose to delay independence instead of insisting upon it with this formula in place, right? Because Indian independence was, according to the British, a lesser priority for the nationalists than Indian unity. That was the very basis of Indian nationalism, right? So this is how the proposal departed from the August offer. क्या क्या देखे हैं हमने? 6 differences. First of all, for the first time, Indians were offered the right to leave the British Commonwealth, effectively presenting them with a path towards complete independence. Secondly, the British accepted that constitution drafting was exclusively an Indian right. Thirdly, there was no overemphasis on minority opinion in the Cripps proposal as compared to the August offer. Fourthly, unlike the August offer, the Cripps proposal for the first time outlined a concrete plan to create a constituent assembly. And for the first time, the participation of princely states was mandated in the Constituent Assembly as well. Thus, the British accepted the political unity of the geographical entity known as the Indian subcontinent. However, the Cripps proposal represented a more direct assault on Indian unity by giving the provinces the right to self-determination. This represented the maturing of the idea of British-sponsored provincialism in India in order to weaken Indian nationalism that had been in place at least since 1919 and more visibly since 1935, when the British Indian provinces were given complete autonomy within British rule. Okay, so these are the major departures from the August offer. Now, what was the Indian response? The Indians unanimously rejected the Cripps proposal, and the Cripps proposal failed. Right. So, can give the heading reasons for the failure of the Cripps proposal. Reasons for the failure of the Cripps proposal. इसमें लिख सकते हो आप. The Cripps proposal failed to satisfy nationalist aspirations and was unanimously rejected Okay. One factor behind this was the attitude of the British government towards the Cripps proposal and Indian aspirations. Right. Now, for the British, the Cripps proposal was not actually meant to secure Indian support. Rather, it was considered to be a major propaganda event for the consumption of its foreign allies, that is, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians. They simply wanted to show them that they had made a sincere effort to secure Indian support and thus diffuse the pressure that they had been feeling from their allies. At the same time, they would be able to discredit the Indian nationalists in the eyes of its foreign allies. The Russians, the Chinese, as well as the Americans had displayed a great deal of sympathy for the Indian nationalists and were supporters of the idea of Indian independence and self-determination. By eliciting or by provoking a rejection of the Cripps proposal, the British had hoped that they would be able to destroy this sympathy by painting Indians as sympathizers of Nazis and the Japanese. Right? So, next point likho. The Cripps proposal was merely an orchestrated propaganda event for Russian or for Soviet, Chinese, and American consumption. Orchestrated propaganda event for Soviet, Chinese, and American consumption. Full stop. The British used it to show their allies that they were sincere about the war effort and the need to sacrifice. So they were sincere about the war effort and sincere about the need to sacrifice. Full stop. At the same time, they wanted to provoke the Indians to launch a mass movement and paint them as Japanese and Nazi sympathizers. Okay? So this was not lost upon the Indians. The Congress rejected the Cripps proposal. Next point, Lipo. The Congress rejected the Cripps proposal on the following grounds. Number one, it offered dominion status. Instead of complete independence. That the Congress had been demanding since 1929. Full stop. Next likho, number 2. The Congress also objected to the representation of princely states by nominees instead of elected representatives. Full stop. This was against the idea of popular sovereignty. Okay? So while the British had agreed not to participate in the Constituent Assembly directly, they were in fact willing or seeking to use the princely states as their proxies in the Constituent Assembly. The nominated representatives of the princely states would in fact be more loyal to the British interests as compared to the wider nationalist interests. Right. So that is why the Congress rejected the August offer based on this principle. Thirdly, the right of self-determination given to the British Indian provinces was a direct assault on Indian unity. Full stop. The British were clearly seeking to delay the transfer of power and derail the national movement. And number 4, all the important provisions including the transfer of power, drafting of Constituent Assembly, were to come into effect after the war, were to come into effect after the war. Full stop. Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi rejected the proposal, commenting that it was a post-dated check on a failing bank. Right? So the Congress did not trust the British to uphold their promises, since the British had a very poor track record with respect to promises made to Indians in the past. Similar promises had also been made in the backdrop of the uh, First World War, and Indian trust had been betrayed. Indians had wholeheartedly supported the British war effort in the First World War. They had been repaid for their loyalty and trust with the 1919 wrongs. That is, the Rowlatt Act, Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, Hunter Inquiry Commission, introduction of diarchy through the Montford reforms of 1919. Indians did not want to repeat the same mistakes, and thus Mahatma Gandhi, on behalf of the nationalists, rejected it. Okay? Now, next, the Muslim League also rejected. The Muslim League also rejected the Cripps proposal on the following grounds. On the following grounds. Firstly, because it criticized the idea of a single Indian Union. Criticized the idea of a single Indian Union. Cripps had refused to entertain the idea of creation of a separate country, separate state of Pakistan. Secondly, right, it also it also opposed the machinery. It also opposed the machinery for setting up the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly. Since it would have favored since it would have favored Hindus, since it would have favored Hindus, right? So India, as a Hindu majority country, would have always had a majority of Hindus within the Constituent Assembly, and Jinnah believed that in such a situation, the creation of Pakistan would have been very difficult. And finally, the Hindu dominated Constituent Assembly would have opted for a strong center which was against the interests of the Muslim minority, which was primarily located in certain Muslim majority provinces in the peripheries of the Indian subcontinent, that is in the west as well as the east. That is why the Muslim League rejected it. Next point likho. The depressed classes also rejected the Cripps proposal, the Cripps proposal on the following grounds. Number one, the proposal had no provisions to protect their interests, number one. Okay? And secondly, they feared that secession of Muslim majority areas would leave them at the mercy of the Hindu majority, right? So if Punjab, Bengal, Sindh, NWFP and Assam, which were Muslim majority provinces, decided not to join the Indian Union, then the depressed classes which were concentrated in the other parts of the subcontinent, which were Hindu majority, they would be left at the mercy of this Hindu majority, right? That is why the depressed classes also rejected it. Next likho. Sikhs also rejected the Cripps proposal, on the grounds that if Punjab seceded from the union, they would be left at the mercy of the Muslim majority, right? Since the Sikh population was concentrated primarily in the region of Punjab, and if Punjab, which was a Muslim majority provinces, decided not to ratify the constitution and establish itself as an independent country, then the Sikhs would be left at the mercy of the Muslim majority. Further, the All India Hindu Mahasabha also rejected the Cripps proposal on the following grounds. Number one, it criticized the right to self-determination given to the provinces as it was a direct attack on Indian unity, And number two, it also criticized the mechanism for setting up the Constituent Assembly. It also criticized the mechanism for setting up the Constituent Assembly through indirect elections by the provincial legislative assemblies, which themselves were elected on the basis of separate electorate. Right? So, since separate electorates were the basis for the election of the provincial legislative assemblies, and the provincial legislative assemblies were to choose the members, were to elect the members from the constituent assembly, then the constituent assembly would be indirectly based on the institution of separate electorates, which the Hindu Mahasabha was morally as well as ideologically opposed to. And secondly, it criticized the right to self-determination given to Indian provinces, which was a direct attack on India's unity. And that is why it also rejected the Cripps proposal. Right? Now, these were the reasons why the Cripps proposal was rejected by the various parties. Now, the proposal, apart from these procedural flaws, also suffered from other limitations. Namely, Cripps did not have much authority to deviate from his opening position. Okay? Now, while the proposal had been drafted by Cripps himself, he was not allowed to deviate from it by the British establishment. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Secretary of State, that is Leo Amery, as well as the Governor General, that is Linlithgow, used to torpedo further efforts by Cripps in order to generate any consensus between the British and the Indian positions. As a result, because of the obstinacy of the Cripps proposal, the situation emerged that the Cripps proposal was too radical for the British government, for Churchill, and at the same time, it was too modest for Indians. Indians were not happy with the kind of progress that the Cripps proposal promised to introduce. Okay? So further you can write Cripps proposal did not have Cripps did not have much authority to deviate from his opening position. Write down the Cripps proposal. The Cripps proposal was too radical. Was too radical for the British, for the British government, and too modest for Indians. And too modest for Indians. Full stop. सब पॉइंट लिखो. Churchill Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, and Lynn Lithgow, that is Governor General and Viceroy. Churchill, the Prime Minister, Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, and Lynn Lithgow, the Governor General, repeatedly torpedoed any further negotiations by uh, the Indians and Cripps, resulting in the emergence of a deadlock. Okay. So this was another reason. The third was a problem with the attitude of Cripps himself, right? Now, from the very first instance, Cripps had made sure to openly tell everybody, the Indians included, that these were not a set of entirely new proposals. Rather, they were meant to cloak the vague proposals made in the August offer with some kind of precision, right? So that means it was not meant to completely redefine India's political future, but it was meant to redefine India's political future within the confines of the offer made by the government in 1940. And this did not inspire either much support or much trust or enthusiasm from the Indian side. So write down. Cripps also insisted that the Cripps proposal were meant to give precise shape to the general terms outlined in the August offer. The general terms outlined in the August offer. Full stop. This resulted in suspicion and low enthusiasm from Indians. Suspicion and low enthusiasm from Indians. Okay. And finally, you can write the procedure outlined by the Cripps proposal to secede from the Union. The procedure outlined by the Cripps proposal to secede from the Union was not well defined. Okay. For example, if Punjab wanted to express that it did not accept the constitution and wanted to draft its own separate constitution, then a resolution supporting such a measure would have to be passed by Punjab's legislative assembly, the provincial legislative assembly, with a 60% majority. Right? If this was not achieved, then the matter would be put forward for the people to decide. A plebiscite would be held, which would have to get at least 50% majority for Punjab to reject the Constituent Assembly and to exit it, forming its own separate Constituent Assembly. Right? So, this was the procedure that was introduced. Problem kya tha isme? That this almost guaranteed that even though the legislators themselves may not have supported the idea of leaving, but the partition of India would become a certainty. Right? So, write down. Procedure was not well defined. Likho. The decision of secession, the decision of secession was to be taken by a resolution in the legislature, by a resolution in the provincial legislature with 60% majority. With 60% majority. Full stop. If less than 60% of the members, if less than 60% of the members supported it, then the decision was to be taken by a plebiscite of adult males, in that province through a simple majority. Full stop. This virtually guaranteed the partition of India and the secession of Muslim majority states such as Punjab, Bengal and Sindh. Right? So these were the factors due to which the Cripps proposal failed. Right? And recently, modern historians have pointed towards a more sinister political plot by Churchill in order to manage not only the Indian question but also political opposition within Britain. Now, Stafford Cripps, as we have already mentioned, was a left-leaning Labourite leader who had openly expressed sympathies towards the Indian national movement. Right? Now, traditionally, he was the kind of politician that conservative leaders such as Winston Churchill and others would feel most threatened by. However, due to the war, Churchill had to admit him into his war cabinet, right? That means Stafford Cripps would essentially have access to all the war planning as well as the British policy towards the colonies. It was therefore dangerous to have him privy to all this information, and it was dangerous to have his influence felt within the cabinet when all these important decisions were being made. Therefore, Churchill devised a very cunning plan in order to distance Stafford Cripps. Right now, if you are aware of world history, you must also be aware that in August of 1939, just before the beginning of the Second World War, Hitler and Stalin had entered into a 10-year non-aggression pact. ठीक है? In September 1939, the Second World War had started. ठीक है ना? And following this, between September 1939 and May of 1940, by May of 1940, Germany had completely occupied Western Europe, and the air war for Britain had started. The episode of German bombing of British cities known as the Blitz was going on, and Britain's home island was being directly threatened. Right? As such, the presence of a left-leaning leader within Churchill's war cabinet had become extremely concerning. Right? And therefore, Churchill now appointed Cripps as the British ambassador to Moscow, to the USSR, with one responsibility and one responsibility alone. That is, for Cripps to convince the USSR to dissolve its pact with Germany and join the war on the British side, right? So Churchill wanted the opening of the Eastern Front against Germany in order to ease the pressure on the British, right? Cripps was also convinced that because he was a left-leaning leader sympathetic to the Soviet Union as well as the cause of anti-imperialism, would have the trust of the Soviets. Now, while Stalin was not ready to budge. In June of 1941, Hitler was the one who violated the 10-year non-aggression pact, right? He launched a military operation known as Operation Barbarossa and invaded the USSR, the Soviet Union, and thus forced Stalin's hand to declare war on Germany. This indirectly meant that Cripps' mission with regards to the USSR had been a resounding success. Cripps became an overnight sensation in British politics and he was welcomed as a hero. Right? However, this was not very good for Churchill, and therefore, when the opportunity presented itself in 1942 to send Cripps away from India once again, Churchill said that since Cripps is such a master statesman, since he is such a seasoned diplomat, he would be the best person to represent the British in front of the Indians. Cripps was sent to India in March 1942. And what were the reasons behind this? Firstly, this would distance Cripps from the war cabinet. Secondly, it would show the allies that the British were sincere about securing Indian support. Now, since the Cripps proposal were designed to fail, since it was the intention of the British not to have the Cripps mission succeed, failure would have done two things at once: discredited Cripps and destroyed Allied sympathy towards Indians by painting Indians as Nazi and Japanese supporters, as Nazi and Japanese sympathizers. Okay? So, this more, you can say, sinister approach has also been pointed out by modern historians, that the Cripps proposal was made not only in the context of the situation in the war and Britain's external environment, but also because of the high level political game that Churchill was playing within the British cabinet and the British government in order to discredit and distant chief opposition from the inner circles of power, right? So that is what we can say. Now take down a question. The draft declaration of the Cripps Proposal was conservative, reactionary, and limited. And finally, the mission ended in failure. Full stop. Comment. ठीक है? Word limit 200. 15 marks. So Cripps proposal draft declaration was conservative, reactionary, and limited. Finally, the mission ended in failure. Comment. So we have to show how it was conservative, how it was reactionary, and how it was limited. And we have to link these weaknesses with the failure of the mission. So you can write down, as the Second World War took a menacing turn, comma, the British Prime Minister Churchill came under growing pressure from the Soviets, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Labour Party of Britain to seek active Indian cooperation. Full stop. Thus, the Cripps mission, led by Sir Stafford Cripps, was sent to India. Full stop. He was a left-wing Labourite minister of Churchill's war cabinet. Who was openly sympathetic to the Indian national movement. Full stop. Next point, right? Although Cripps announced that the aim of the proposal was the earliest possible realization of responsible government in India, of responsible government in India, of self-government in India, that the aim of the proposal was the realization, earliest possible realization of self-government in India, comma, the draft declaration that he brought with him, the draft declaration that he brought with him was disappointing, was disappointing. Full stop. It proposed A B C करके लिखो. A, dominion status after the war, dominion status after the war. B, a constitution making body, a constitution making body after the war, a constitution making body after the war, whose members would be elected indirectly by the provincial assemblies and nominated in case of princely states, and nominated in case of princely states. C, the Pakistan demand, was accepted indirectly, with the provision that any province would have the right to reject the constitution, would have the right to reject the constitution. Full stop. Next point, main point. The Secretary of State Leo Emery, described the declaration as a conservative, reactionary and limited proposal. Which was meant to cloak the provisions of the August offer, in precision. So what does this effectively mean? That the British were not ready to offer anything more. They were more than happy to stick to the position that they had adopted in the August offer itself. Right? As a conservative, reactionary and limited proposal, which was meant to cloak the proposals of the provisions of the August offer in precision. Full stop. Next point. Mahatma Gandhi rejected the offer as a post-dated check on a failing bank. Full stop. Next point. All major political parties rejected the Cripps proposal, either on the grounds that it did not offer complete independence, or that none of its important provisions were to have immediate effect, or because of the flawed mechanism of electing the constituent assembly, setting up the constituent assembly, or due to the right of self-determination given to provinces, or because the proposal indirectly accommodated or indirectly ensured the future partition of India. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. The Indian leadership was also aware of the fact that Cripps had little authority to move beyond the original draft. Full stop. The British Prime Minister, Secretary of State, and Governor General remained hostile towards Cripps, and repeatedly torpedoed his efforts to negotiate further beyond the draft proposals. Full stop. Next point. Therefore, the Cripps proposal was destined to fail. Next point. However, the failure of the Cripps proposal produced results that were not expected by the British. What had they expected? That the Indians are going to launch a mass movement that they would be able to easily suppress by locking away the Indian leadership. However, by this point of time, the British rule had become so unbearable to Indians that even without the leadership in the picture, the masses began to revolt spontaneously, and a violent Quit India movement raged for almost 2 years before it could be uh, suppressed and the situation could be normalized. The Quit India movement proved to be the final blow for the British Empire in India. It proved to be the last nail in the coffin of the British Indian Empire, and convinced the British that their days in India are now over. It is simply a matter of when rather than a matter of if British rule is going to end in India. By sending the Cripps proposal and by arranging for its failure, the British had hoped to perpetuate their rule in India. However, it ended up accelerating the demise of the British Indian Empire. Likho. The British had expected a mass movement, a peaceful mass movement that could be easily suppressed, and and that the British would be able to justify their actions to their allies. So stop. Instead, the failure of the proposal led to the Quit India movement, that accelerated the demise of the British Indian Empire. All right. So this is how the Cripps proposal failed, because it was designed to fail. The attitude of the British and the attitude of the Indians was so far apart that there was no question of a compromise. And the nationalist leadership was left with little option but to organize another mass movement, right? That was the Quit India movement. So this was the Cripps proposal and the factors behind its failure. We have looked at the important provisions. We have also considered the background, and we have also seen how the Cripps proposal or Cripps mission was occasioned by a brewing political storm within Britain, and how Churchill had masterminded the setting up as well as the failure of the Cripps proposal in order to distance Cripps from the war cabinet, right? So ये तो हो गया Cripps proposal. Next topic we have to cover is the Quit India movement, that we are going to do in our next lecture tomorrow. All right. So I hope there are no doubts. All right. Thank you. Chaliye then. Thank you for your time, guys. I'll see you in our next lecture.